She's a leading global expert on the design of carbon pricing policies. She joined Brookings in 2008 from the Joint Economic Committee of the US Congress, where she advised members and staff on economic, energy, and environmental policy. Before her work in Congress, Adele was a lead natural resource economist for the US Treasury Department for 9 years. In that position, she informed and represented Treasury's positions on agriculture, energy, climate, and radio spectrum policies. On assignment to the US Department of State in 2000, she led negotiations on land use and forestry issues in the International Climate Change Treaty process. Prior to joining the Treasury, she served as a senior economist for environmental affairs at the President's Council of Economic Advisors during the development of the Kyoto Protocol. Adele began her career at the Office of Management and Budget, where she oversaw rulemaking by agricultural and natural resource agencies. Adele is also a member of the Climate Change and Energy Program in CAMA. So Frank Yontso is professor at the ANU Crawford School of Public Policy, where he directs the Center for Climate and Energy Policy. He's an environmental economist. His research focuses on policy for climate change and energy in the context of economic reform and development. Frank is the joint editor-in-chief of the journal Climate Policy and a lead author of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 5th and 6th Assessment Reports. Frank leads work on recovery from the COVID-induced economic slump. The focus of his work is on opportunities for low-carbon investment in Australia's energy industry, transport and housing sectors, including through government stimulus packages. He and his team also analysed trends in energy use and emissions and in private sector investment, and trends in government policy and investment responses around the world. He's also a member of the Climate Change and Energy Program in CAMA. Professor Warwick McKibben is Professor of Public Policy and Director of the Centre for Applied Macroeconomic Analysis in the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. He's also Director of Policy Engagement and Node Leader in the ARC Centre of Excellence in Population Ageing Research. He's an ANU Public Policy Fellow, a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences, a Distinguished Public Policy Fellow of the Economic Society of Australia, a Distinguished Fellow of the Asian Pacific Policy Society, a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C. He's the Foundation Director of CAMA and Foundation Director of the ANU Research School of Economics. Warwick served for a decade on the board of the Reserve Bank of Australia until July 2011. He also served as a member of the Australia's Prime Minister's Science, Engineering, Innovation Council and on the Task Force on Uranium Mining Process and Nuclear Energy in Australia. He was awarded the Centenary Medal in 2003 and was made an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2016. So Adele will have 20 minutes for her presentation, and then we will just go straight into remarks of around 5 minutes each for Frank and Warwick. And then we hope to have some rigorous discussion at the end of the presentations. So if you'd like to ask a question, just please use the Q&A function on Zoom and type your question into that box. And I will either invite you to ask your question on camera, or you can ask your question through text. So I would also like to let you know that we are recording this session, and the recording will be available on the CAMA webpage after the presentations. So thank you for joining us, and I'd like to now ask Adele to proceed with her remarks.
Well, thank you, Renee. Thanks very much. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to be with you. And I'm delighted to be on this panel with Frank and Warwick, and I look forward to their remarks. I thought I'd start by just saying a few things about our election. And I don't know, it's been kind of a painful process, but it looks like it's on the way to wrapping up. And the reason I want to start with the election is because it has profound impacts on the direction of US climate policy. And so I'm going to talk kind of about the US framework of policy going forward. And I'm going to let Frank and Warwick talk about kind of what this means for the international scene. So we have two houses of Congress. In the House of Representatives, the Democrats retained their control over that House of Congress. They lost a little bit of the lead that they have in the number of seats, which was certainly a disappointment to the Democrats, but they're still going to control the agenda and set hearings and be able to pass legislation. Now, the Senate is in a different status. So the Republicans had controlled the Senate. And for those of you who don't follow American political parties, it's really the Democrats that have a positive climate agenda, and the Republicans have mainly been kind of opposed to anything that looks like meaningful climate policy. So the Senate is on the razor's edge. It's 48 to 50 right now. There's 100 members, and there are 2 seats left to go. And these are 2 Senate seats in Georgia, which has a rule that if a candidate doesn't get at least 50% of the vote, then there's a runoff. So there's going to be a runoff for 2 sitting senators in Georgia. And if they both go to the Democratic challengers, then the Democrats control the Senate, and that changes a lot about what could happen legislatively. If either of those seats go to a Republican, then the Republicans retain control of the Senate, and there's probably very little that can be done, at least unilaterally, by the Democrats. Maybe there's potential for bipartisan legislation, but it would have to involve quite a big change in the positions of the Republicans. So Congress is kind of potentially pretty split here. And then in the White House, we now have the Biden-Harris administration to be inaugurated on January 20th, which in my view can't come fast enough. And we're seeing really interesting things out of the transition. So President-elect Biden has announced a number of key members of his cabinet and White House staff. And as we say in DC, personnel is policy. We're seeing really the elevation of climate as a priority for President-elect Biden. And I think we're going to see really an unprecedented emphasis on climate, not just in the White House or the Environmental Protection Agency, but really across the whole of government. And we're already seeing that in the appointments of John Kerry as the climate envoy. He's going to be this guy who really represents the US in the international process. And he's an old hand at these issues. And we also have someone, Brian Deese, who had worked very actively on climate for the Obama administration, is going to be ahead of the National Economic Council, which is a key White House economic organization. And we're also seeing, this is very interesting, the appointment of Janet Yellen as Treasury Secretary. And Janet has a long history of, being informed and concerned about climate, going back to the days when she was chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors under Bill Clinton. And I happened to work with her. I was the senior economist for environmental affairs while we were both preparing for the Kyoto Protocol and then analyzing the agreement afterwards. And so she knows a lot about climate. I expect her to be active on this issue. She's spoken out vigorously about climate and the need for a carbon pricing policy, and she's advocated a carbon tax, in part through the Climate Leadership Council, which is a non-governmental organization that she's sort of been active in. And what I think this means for the Treasury Department is it's not just going to be going to the climate talks as a source of funding for climate finance. They're really going to get engaged in the policy dimensions of climate amongst those countries with targets or other major commitments. And I think that's really important because, no offense to the environment ministries, but they don't tend to be the most powerful ones. And so seeing the US Treasury really get in there and start talking substance, to me, I think will be a welcome and important change. So the first thing we're going to see is the US rejoin the Paris Agreement, which is terrific. However, the challenge is going to be, what is the US nationally determined contribution going to be, and how will we achieve that? And if they're going to have an ambitious target of some kind, the question arises, what legal authority is the executive branch going to use to reduce emissions to achieve that target? And that was actually a problem for the Obama administration. They promised a target, but they didn't really have the legal authorities they needed to achieve that target. And they kind of got a pass because everybody was so excited that the US was in there and actually committing to things. They didn't ask some of the really hard questions about, well, how are you really going to do this? So I think that same conundrum is going to apply to the Biden administration. And I think as expectations rise about what our commitment should be, the challenge of how we're going to do that will dramatically amplify. Now, if you want to see the whole, rundown of what it is the Democrats want to do on climate, there's 3 documents you could look at. One is the president's president-elect's climate plan that he issued as a candidate, which is kind of sparse on details, as you might expect. But there are 2 other documents. There's the House Select Committee on Climate Crisis Report, which has 547 pages of detailed ideas of what the government should pursue to address the climate crisis. And the Senate Democrats issued an analogous report through its special committee on the climate crisis, and that's only 260 pages. But there are a lot of things in there. I'm going to give you some kind of headline things that I think they might try to accomplish, but I don't know that it's going to be feasible to do all that stuff. Okay, and if you want to look through, okay, so you should just know that this administration is going to be a complete 180 from the Trump administration, just as the Trump administration was a 180 from the Obama administration. So, you could get whiplash watching how the US positions are going to change. And if you want to see kind of what Trump has done over the 4 years in terms of deregulation, Brookings .edu website has a nice deregulation tracker, and you can see not just for environmental matters, but in all sorts of regulatory programs, how the Trump administration has unraveled some of the existing rules that govern all kinds of things, but a lot of things very relevant to climate change. And we can expect the Biden administration to, again, do a re-regulation. The challenge, of course, is how fast they can do it. And then again, how durable is that going to be, depending on who is the next resident of the White House. But some of the key programs will be trying to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. I'm going to start with the things they can do with executive authority they already have. This was the Clean Air Act was pursued by the Obama administration, and they came out with a regulation of CO2 from the power sector called the Clean Power Plan. I think we could expect kind of son of Clean Power Plan under Biden, perhaps with more ambitious targets. The challenge they were going to have is, number one, because that statute wasn't designed for greenhouse gases, the agency is going to be kind of stretching the limits of their authority. And then that's going to get litigated, and it's going to go to a Supreme Court that now is more heavily conservative and may look askance at some of this agency discretion. So whether or not that kind of regulation can survive the litigation now, I think is a really open question. The other disadvantage of using that authority is just it takes so slow. It's very slow. I mean, it took the Obama administration 6 years to get one rule on one stationary source sector, and it was finalized, but it hadn't gotten through the Supreme Court, and it wouldn't have taken effect until 2023 anyway. So Biden's folks are going to have to move a lot more quickly if they're going to do something meaningful with that rulemaking authority, or really any rulemaking authority that they already have. They'll probably also re-regulate methane emissions from oil and gas production on federal lands, and the fuel economy standards that the Obama administration had tightened up. We might see a moratorium on mineral leasing, oil and gas and coal from federal lands and waters. We also might see some approach to trying to add a carbon-related charge to the royalty payments of those minerals, particularly coal from federal lands. We'll probably see some effort to use federal dollars for procurement and contracting to steer federal acquisition and contracting towards greener goods and services, perhaps including some kind of shadow price on greenhouse gases as part of contract selection. We're also going to see a 180 on the value of the social cost of carbon that the federal government uses to monetize changes in greenhouse gas emissions, plus or minus from rules. And this is really important. It's kind of an arcane thing, but it matters a lot whether carbon is valued at $50 per ton of CO2 or $5 per ton of CO2, for example. And Obama had a value that they were justifying with citing literature and so on. And Obama, with the stroke of the pen, could change that because that's just an executive order. And what that does is it allows rules to be tighter in emissions because the monetized benefits then justify the cost. But if you reduce that value you use for the benefits, then the rules will necessarily end up more lax. So we're going to see, I think, a rapid shift back to a more ambitious social cost of carbon. And we'll probably also see more skepticism about approving things like the Keystone XL pipeline and other fossil fuel related infrastructure that has to go through federal approval. Now, so that's just kind of a smattering of some of the things the administration can do. But the question is, what does that add up to? Is that enough authority, and can they use it quickly enough to really reduce emissions to achieve a target that's sort of significant in the eyes of the world? I think that jury is out, and probably the answer is no, which is unfortunate, but it really does point to, needing a path towards new legislation. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But just to wrap up executive authority, one of the things the Biden administration can do is make appointments to the leadership of independent agencies that can foster their progress on climate. So for example, the Federal Reserve just asked for membership in the network for greening the financial system. So we're seeing the Fed move towards engaging on climate, which is something they really had, I think, hesitated to do, especially in comparison to their counterparts in the EU and elsewhere. So we'll see, I think, the Fed continuing to engage on climate, things like, stress testing and including climate in some of their financial supervisory responsibilities. I think we're also going to see a climate-friendly Securities and Exchange Commission and probably some new regulations around climate-related corporate disclosure. And we might also see some climate shifts from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and so on, where they've been talking about pricing carbon in the electricity sector that they oversee. And then another thing they can do administratively is structure the budget or any kind of special spending package and emphasize climate in that regard. I think the challenge will be if there's a stimulus package or a recovery package of some kind, trying to find a way to address climate in it that really kind of makes sense as stimulus or recovery spending. Because, the sectors that have been hit the hardest in the United States, like leisure and hospitality, are not necessarily the same sectors, such as the power sector or electric vehicles, that are the ones you kind of need to work on for purposes of addressing climate. But I think they'll find some things, and I think there are things that they're going to do that could make some sense. I think we'll see attention to electric vehicle charging infrastructure. There's a lot of interest in expanding grid storage, some energy around small modular nuclear reactors, and getting the the science and economics of those improved. I think there's some interest in carbon capture and storage and encouraging that or doing research on it, although the economics of it really have not yet matured. I think one area there's some attention to is taking advantage of oil and gas workers who are now unemployed and putting them to work tapping abandoned wells. And that actually makes a ton of sense in my view. Now, finally to legislation, and this is going to be brief because there's not that much they can do without some kind of bipartisan approach. The big thing's going to, the big options would be some kind of carbon tax or cap and trade program. It's hard to see exactly how that's going to make progress in the Senate, but that would be obviously one of the bigger, most effective things, especially if it's economy-wide. There might be some traction for a clean energy standard, clean electricity standard, a tradable performance program in the power sector. I think the challenge there is, it begs the question, what are you doing for all the other sectors? The Biden campaign talked a little bit about border carbon adjustments. I'm not sure what they're adjusting if they don't have some kind of pricing program on CO2. So we'll see where that goes. Probably the most likely thing is going to be an extension of existing tax credits for wind and solar and that kind of thing. And these are pretty small bore policies, and especially now that these renewables are actually in some cases more cost effective than the fossil alternatives, it's not really clear how much those tax credits are going to do relative to a scenario where they were let to expire. There are a few things that the Biden administration can't reverse, and that would be things like new oil and gas leases on federal property. They're trying to do an auction in our Arctic Wildlife Refuge, but I think some of that stuff is going to be tangled up in court, and we'll see whether there's actually interest on the part of industry to bid on those leases when they're far from infrastructure and oil and gas prices are as low as they are right now. So that's kind of the landscape of the U.S. And I want to turn it to Frank, and he can make sense of the international situation.
Adele, great to hear from you, and I'm sure there will be a lot of interest in the question and answer about what we may expect in the US. Exciting time. So the international process, climate change process is getting some real tailwind here from the net zero emissions announcements that some major countries have made. So there's legislation to net zero mid-century in several EU countries, in the UK, political agreement at the EU level in several member states, recent announcements, of course, by Japan, Korea, other countries, and perhaps in many ways, right now perceived to be most important, China's net zero emissions announcement for 2060. So, I mean, it's tempting to dismiss long-term announcements like this, as cheap talk. But of course, another interpretation is that this reflects what governments actually see happening or anticipate will happen, because business and the finance industry, to a large extent, are beginning to reorient their investment plans towards clean energy, clean industrial processes, and they see that timeframe, the 30-year timeframe, as long enough for such an outcome to be potentially realistic, and governments in that environment, I think, quite reasonably see an opportunity for evolving economic advantage in a clean energy economy. And that's certainly a big topic of discussion in Australia. We're now a very large fossil fuel exporter, but also we've got practically unlimited low-cost renewable energy supply potential. And it's quite conceivable, at least, that new energy-intensive industries could be established on that basis for export in Australia. A few words about China. So, I mean, the net zero announcement from China was really in many ways quite momentous, because, you know, I mean, let that sink in. This says that China sees itself as only 10 years behind in decarbonization, behind the more kind of progressive Western jurisdictions. Okay, so that's really significant, in particular in light of the very rapid and very large buildup of carbon-intensive infrastructure that took place in China between, say, 2000 to 2012, 2014. So that's really a bigger challenge in China in many ways than in most Western countries, where the existing high carbon capital stock tends to be older. Now, for China, this is clearly industrial strategy as much as anything else, you know, positioning for industrial policy or industry leadership in some of these emerging industries, whether they're electricity, whether grid technology, building technology, and perhaps very importantly, transport as well, mixed, you know, with a good dose of energy independency. There, of course, we're seeing very strong efforts in China there to get away from energy imports, and one of the easiest ways of doing that for the long term is renewables. One thing I wanted to mention is, in the international realm, is all countries are called on to submit long-term low emissions strategies in the lead up to COP26 in November next year. Various countries have done various things along those lines. Adele, you mentioned something from the US. For other countries, there's a real opportunity here to kick off a process that actually draws out all of the knowledge that exists in the think tanks, in the universities, among industry associations. Put it all on the table. Let's be clear about what different transition trajectories could look like. What are the technical options? What are the economic opportunities? And I want to finish on just a few thoughts on the role of governments in all of this. So, like Adele mentioned, clean energy, renewable energy, in many places, in many applications, no longer need subsidies. Certainly the case in the Australian electricity system. Costs are still coming down. And so we will see that transition that's happening now in the electricity system in many countries, in many places. We will see that play out in industry and transport as well. Nevertheless, there will be some specific applications where using fossil fuels or emissions intensive processes in general will remain the privately cheapest option. And there, cement, for example, and there you see a very important role, of course, for policy and carbon pricing preferentially. Also to observe that the US and Australia are now, of course, quite notable outliers among developed countries for not having a carbon price, at least not nationally. Second role for policy, help facilitating the transition. So the politics of climate change, as we observe it, really seems hardest in the declining fossil fuel regions. Okay, so jobs and regional prosperity, huge issue. You know, I mean, we've seen this in what happened in the US in recent years. We're seeing it play out in Australian federal and to an extent state politics very heavily. And there, of course, is also a link to economic policy in the post-pandemic recovery, right? And so I think there's no universal recipes here, but clearly there will be opportunities to link fiscal stimulus measures to government-led or government-funded investment in long-term infrastructure that supports low-carbon structures rather than locking in high-carbon structures. And just finally, one thought on border carbon adjustments. Adele, I had to smile when you said that, yes, Biden talks about BCAs, but if there's no federal carbon price or equivalent policy, then what basis do you have on slapping tariffs on others? Now, it does seem that the European Union is considering this very imminently, in fact, right? And obviously the goal is not just to put pressure on other countries, but to shield domestic industries. And so I predict we will see a very strong supporting push from domestic industries in any country where border carbon adjustments are being considered, right? And so there's a clear risk of a sort of a negative dynamic that might ultimately result in trade diversion and even a kind of a split for emissions intensive commodities into a sort of a green trading bloc and a brown trading bloc. And I'm certainly wary of the dangers that lurk that way. Okay, so thanks very much and look forward to a discussion.
Okay, I guess it's over to me. I just want to make sure that you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. And you can also see me, presumably. No, thanks very much, Adele. That was a fantastic overview. I'm just wondering whether you're optimistically pessimism or you're pessimistically optimist. And I think you're a realist. And I think it's very important that we distinguish the aspirations of the incoming administration from what we can actually do in the near term. Having said that, I think it's really important now that the US has joined back into or will join very shortly back into the Paris Agreement. Frank's already talked about the political pressure that this will put on countries such as Australia, and that's an important part of the process, but you can always resist political pressure. What I want to focus on is what the economic pressures will now be on Australia. And the key issue here is when you look at the impact of global policy changes, and so we start having countries decarbonising, this has a big impact in two dimensions on Australia. One is the demand for fossil fuels will drop. So the quantity of exports, of Australia's exports into key markets such as Japan and China and Korea will be affected. But more importantly, it will be the impact on prices. And so the price of fossil fuels will generally fall in global markets. So even if our global trading partners, our key export industries, export markets, even if they don't change their policies directly on Australia, the price of fossil fuels will drop. And that'll have a big impact on Australia's national income, and it'll have a big impact on the federal budget, amongst other sources of revenue, state and federal sources of revenue. So if you look at the quantification of this, and I've done some work with Adele and Pete Wilcoxon and Larry Liu and others, and if you look at going all the way back to the report to the Abbott government on what targets Australia should take to the Paris Agreement, we found in that early 2015 study that 80% of the economic costs of a global climate agreement come from the actions of other countries on Australia's exports. And so this is not really a question about what Australia's domestic energy generation should look like. It's a question of what happens to national income when some of our key export industries are severely impacted. And this is where Frank's point is very important. We have a great opportunity to be moving into a fossil-free world with enormous potential for renewable energy exports. And I think if you then look forward, the next study that we did, the Paris Agreement study that Adele co-authored with myself and others, a similar result. The impact on Australia of taking action is really the global impact rather than the domestic policy choices. So for a smart country, really it's the domestic adjustment that we need to undertake, not just for how we generate energy and how we use energy, but our sources of income, because they will be severely impacted, even if you ignore the political implications and political pressures on Australia. Finally, Frank did mention the importance of infrastructure in a green recovery. The World Economic Outlook last month, the IMF, International Monetary Fund World Economic Outlook, has a chapter 3, which I was a co-author of, where we looked at zero net emissions by 2050 for the world and what this implies, and the sort of policies that you need to minimize the costs and actually take advantage of the benefits. And that includes a significant infrastructure program on green energy, and also a very clear carbon pricing framework. And so picking up Frank's point about what's needed in Australia is now is the time for a very transparent carbon pricing mechanism, and it has to be a credible carbon price, not necessarily a carbon tax that can be badly designed, but it needs to be a very clear bipartisan policy. And this is to not only enable the industries in Australia to transition from fossil fuel dependence to a renewable energy world, but also to enable the long-term investment to come into the market to stimulate the economy, and therefore to increase the speed of the COVID recovery. So I'll stop there. It was a great presentation, Adele, and I look forward to Q&A. Thank you.
Great. So thank you, Adele, Frank, and Warwick. So I'll now invite our attendees to pose any questions that they might have in the Q&A panel. But before we do that, I might ask Adele if she would like to comment on anything that Warwick and Frank had to say in their presentations.
Oh, well, first, always things to work when he gives a plug for our research. And so thanks. I do think that's an interesting paper. And for those who are really interested in the outcomes of international agreements, it is an important finding that, you know, everybody fixates on the commitments of their own country, but these international spillovers can be really important. And, you know, you got to be prepared. Well, and we see it even within the United States, right? So the state of Wyoming, a big coal producer, they might be able to preserve the coal-fired power plants within the boundaries of Wyoming. But what's going to determine what happens in Wyoming are the policies of the other states and the federal government, right? So states don't have much control over what's going to happen to them. And that makes it all the more important what Frank said about preparing for the transition. And so I've been doing a lot of work looking at what some of the risks are to coal-reliant communities, and in terms of economic activity, but also in terms of their fiscal system, because so many of these state and local governments rely so heavily on coal production for revenue. It's not just that their economy is going to be impacted, but they're going to have to really revise their entire revenue system. And that's very disruptive for them. But, you know, they're going to have to just come to the realization that that makes them like every other state that doesn't have coal and has to have an income tax or a sales tax or some combination of the usual suspect revenue instruments if you can't rely anymore on mineral production for your whole tax base.
Great. Thanks. Any questions from the audience? Please post them into the Q&A box. So I wanted to ask Adele, what do you think? How do you think the Republican Party are going to change their attitude? Will they change their attitudes towards the climate policy after Trump has left the White House? I mean, do we see these things changing very much, or what do you think the move is?
Far be it for me to get inside the heads of Republican leaders, because the kinds of rhetoric and dialogue we've had around the election and pretty much every other issue, it, you know, is not something I can relate to. So I don't really understand, you know, why it's been so sustainable for so long that they've been, you know, able to get away with a climate change is a hoax kind of position. I do think that the more responsible members of the party really have moved on from that and are more like, okay, the climate's changing, but can we do anything about it? Or is it, you know, human caused? But I also think there's a limit to how far this continual dispute over the science can go, because just we're seeing it. This was the worst hurricane year. I mean, we've had landfall of multiple hurricanes this season. There were a total of 30 named hurricanes in the Atlantic this season. And some of them actually hit in the same spot in Louisiana. And, you know, how long can that kind of thing go on? Or watch the fires in California. Over 4 million acres burned this season in California. That's more than double the previous record of acres burned in the state of California. So I think, you know, certainly your audience in Australia can relate to that. And I just think that it, you know, people are going to start seeing with their own eyes the damages of a disrupted climate. So I gotta think that there's gonna be movement. My fear is that they're gonna start kind of making up kind of weak tea policies and say that's their platform. we kind of already see that a little bit with an innovation agenda, right? Oh, well, we're going to innovate our way out of, our emissions portfolio. Well, there's nothing wrong with innovation, and far be it for me to criticize that, the important role that research and development can have. But what's the driver of the market for these innovative products? Yeah, so unless you address supply and demand, I don't think, innovation is gonna solve our problems. And I really hope, the international community is gonna hold our feet to the fire and make sure that we pledge things that are legitimate and that we follow through, and that that hopefully maybe some of that pressure will help, but nothing's worked so far.
Great, thank you. We have a question from the audience from Jenny Gordon. So the question is, how do you think the EU will levy border adjustment taxes? Will the UK join in, and will it be WTO compliant? I don't know who wants to answer that.
Can I give that to Frank?
Sounds like a
who knows, right, Jenny? Who knows? Look, I mean, the general view is that border carbon adjustments are tricky in terms of WTO, but ultimately probably within the rules. If it can be demonstrated that there is a genuine environmental regulation with teeth in the country, leveraging levying the border carbon adjustment, so that would be a given in the European Union. What the UK would do, I really don't couldn't speculate. I'm not even sure that the UK is such a big player in the industries that you'd be thinking about, because you'd be thinking steel above everything else, and probably aluminium. I'm thinking possibly cement, but Jenny, you may well want to voice a view on this. Oh, hang on, we haven't got it. I'm catching Jenny unawares. Oh, there you go.
Sorry. Yes, I think it's just a really, really hard one. And how those border tax adjustments are actually done, I think will be pretty critical. And also you've got to think of all the various trade agreements that we have as well, and negotiating through the myriad of those, and where we made commitments and where we carved out and the like. So it makes it quite challenging, I think, to try and work out how they'll actually go about doing that. So that's what we're trying to do, is understand what the impact on Australian trade might be of those kinds of border tax adjustments, and then how far they carry through. So, if they, if China doesn't have them and we're selling, the energy to China, do they then sort of look at the uncarbon taxed component of the energy we sold to China embodied in the product that is then sold to the Europeans? So I guess it can get very complex very quickly. So yeah, I'd really value views. I don't know the answer, in other words.
Well, can I jump in there for a sec? Because, can I?
Oh, go ahead, Warren.
Yeah. So if I could jump in there very quickly, because we have several papers where we've looked at border carbon adjustments, one with Pete Wilcoxon in 2006 for Lael Brainard, who's now on the Fed board, and one with Adele. And one of the issues is you can have a carbon tax and you can tax coal, oil and gas coming in. That's perfectly legitimate with WTO regulations, because you're taxing your own coal the same way that you're taxing the imports of coal. The complexity comes in when you're talking about embodied carbon in products. And in a model like ours, you can actually work that out. And you find the first thing that happens is the costs to the importing country far outweigh any benefits. Secondly, it's almost impossible to know where the electrons came from. So how do you know if the electricity was hydro versus coal in a source country? You can use averages, which you get around the problem. But in the end, the complexity is so great, and the potential destruction of the global trading system is so costly, that using border carbon adjustment is a very, very bad idea, except as part of a carbon tax or cap and trade system where you're identifying the fossil fuels themselves.
What I was going to say is, so I think it might be relevant that every single legislative proposal in the United States, in the bills that have been introduced in this Congress, has some kind of border carbon adjustment in it. And if you're interested in how American legislators have been thinking about this, you can look at a paper of mine called Making Border Carbon Adjustments Work in Law and Practice. And it's kind of a legislative side-by-side of how these different bills kind of think about structuring a border adjustment in the context of an economy-wide carbon fee or tax. And so, but I would say that legislatively, that language really hasn't been elaborated. I would even go so far as to call it a little half-baked at this point. I don't really know how that language would play out if we were actually, in a real legislative discussion.
Okay, so I would now like to ask Howard Bamsey to join as a panelist. He was the former Australian climate envoy and now is honorary professor in our college at the university.
Thanks very much, Renee. I just wanted to add a couple of points from my experience some time ago on this question of border tax adjustments. I mean, the issue's been around for a very long time, and about 12 years ago, I guess it is now, there were a couple of politicians in France with some influence in Brussels who were pushing quite hard. And in the end, nobody really was willing to take the step. I'm not too sure exactly why, but I suspect for the sorts of reasons that Warwick and Adele have mentioned. But at that time, I did talk to senior people in WTO and to colleagues in DFAT, and in both places there was some analysis done, and the conclusion was that there was certainly WTO compliant means of imposing those adjustments. There was really not much doubt about that at all, but it's the real world constraints, the sorts of things that Warwick mentioned that held people back. And since that time, the whole understanding of the climate response as burden sharing, and therefore the need to ensure there's no free riding, has changed. And we now see that the transition to a climate-friendly economy presents just as many opportunities as it does burdens, and indeed in many ways it's now, people have been using quite frequently in this context the word suicide in the last few days, and it is obviously going to be very destructive to economies if they lag the transition. And so I think the motivation for border tax adjustments as a compliance measure is now much less than it was then. And if still carries those adjustments would still carry with them the same problems for the international trade system, then I'm not sure how realistic they will be. But if you designed, and some people in DFAT did some work on this too, if you designed the border tax adjustments in such a way that they were not primarily focused on ensuring compliance with cost of carbon requirements, but more on facilitating revenue gathering and generally gave them a facilitative design, that could be of much greater interest these days. I have seen the outline of such a scheme, but it's now some time since then, and it'd have to be looked at again. But I think that's a possibility, perhaps.
Would anyone like to comment on the previous discussion? No? Okay. We just have one question in the Q&A box. The funny, of course, it's not funny thing is the long-term national CO2 emission drops are supposed to be reached with CO2 global emissions not going down as fast as needed, while diverting huge funds to promote green technologies, renewable energies. And this is hard to admit, also diverting huge funds to repair the damage driven by Earth's climate system components out of control, say higher frequency natural disasters. Is there a sincere way to start thinking in that scenario, which will imply severe macroeconomic theoretical changes? So that's from Hernan L. Villagran. Would anyone like to tackle that easy one?
I'm not sure what the question is. Is it that we need to change the way we think about macroeconomics because of this balance between the cost of taking action and the impacts of climate events? So yeah, I'm not really sure what the question is.
I think there is one nugget in there that I can address, and that's looking at the costs associated with climatic disruption. And I think we're still grappling with that right now. For example, the insurance companies that are operating in California in the areas where there were these horrible fires, they're pulling out, and they're not dumb. They don't want to insure areas that are at such risk. And then the California government says, no, you can't pull out. So, grappling with who's going to bear the ultimate incidence of these costs. Is it going to be companies and which people, or taxpayers or households or governments or what? I think there's a big reckoning coming in how those costs are going to be distributed across society. And some of those costs are inevitable. And I don't think at least in the US, our tort law system or our insurance system or our financial system has really yet grappled as they will have to do around these costs.
Great, thank you, Dal. So we've invited Jack Pezzi to come and make some comments, ask some questions.
I think you might be muted, Jack. I can't hear you.
You're on mute, Jack.
I think there's something wrong with the speaker.
Oh, there. Okay. Jack, can you try again?
No.
Oh, still can't hear him.
Okay.
I'm so sorry. Well, I can see some of his question in the little question box, and it looks like a question to me. So I'll just read it out. He's asking about the potential for energy storage and transmission, and what percentage renewable supply might be feasible in the United States, and how that might depend on the harsher winters in the United States, and who's promising what around 100% renewables. So the Biden administration, or the Biden campaign, proposed totally decarbonizing on net the US electricity sector within 15 years, which is an extremely ambitious target. And there are lots of people who are, electricity experts. I won't characterize myself as one of them, but I do think that as you get more and more renewable penetration into the grid, these issues around storage and intermittency and all the practical issues that Jack rightly raises are gonna become more and more important. And so you got to have a technology agenda, but you also have to have a sensible way of achieving this goal. And so far, there hasn't been a lot of specificity. Okay, you have a target, but how are you going to get there? And there are going to have to be multiple policy inputs to drive the electricity sector anywhere near that goal. you know, within the 15-year time frame that they're talking about.
Sure.
Can
you hear me
Oh
now?
yes, Jack, you're on.
Yes. I'm wearing my headphones. So just as a quick follow-up to that, do you have any idea of the split between regulation and legislation? I really don't know how the US electricity transmission and storage system might work. Is there much that a Biden administration can do just by regulations to facilitate, you know, new transmission lines, whatever else that might be needed, or is there a big need for a legislation?
Well, you know what? I think the jury's still out, almost literally, because they're I'm sure going to try to use existing authority under the Clean Air Act, because that's what the Obama administration tried to do. The problem is you don't know how far the EPA can go. This is our Environmental Protection Agency, can go without risking their rulemaking in the Supreme Court. So the more ambitious and creative they get, the tougher that court process is going to be for them. And so certainly, you know, in principle, we can go some ways towards that goal with existing regulatory authority. They're going to have to move fast, and they're going to have their crack lawyers on it. But ultimately, I think a much better approach would be to use new bipartisan legislation that can do it in a much more cost-effective way. Because the existing authority, at least as it was exercised before, kind of involves a sector by sector, state by state implementation, which is kind of intrinsically less cost effective than a more coherent, you know, sector-wide approach, if not economy-wide approach.
Okay, so we're starting to run out of time. We just have a few other questions that are left on the Q&A, so we'll go through those before we finish. So a message from Karen Durand. Since the USA has nuclear, firming should be less of an issue. Yes, I don't know what that means, so I'll just leave that to the panel.
Can I just add that? I was going to answer because the thing about America is nuclear is about 9% of electricity and hydro is about 7%. So there is a difference between renewable energy and clean energy. We don't have that clear distinction in Australia because we don't have any nuclear, but there is a base load coming from nuclear and renewable and hydro in the US, which is around 16% of electricity. I think that's right, Adele, is it?
Well, the challenge for nuclear is that it's, you know, there are costs associated with extending the lives of existing nuclear plants, and that is greenhouse gas free electricity. But natural gas has been so cheap that it's making it less competitive to keep those nuclear plants alive longer. And so I think one of the urgent factors actually in getting a policy going in our power sector is to preserve the existence of that existing nuclear. I don't see a lot of new nuclear beating out other, you know, zero carbon electricity like wind and solar, but trying to keep existing nuclear alive, I think is important to keep that going, because then that's something you don't have to replace with more renewables with all the problems we were just talking about. But we're going to have some policy, because otherwise natural gas is going to eat nuclear's lunch, and we're going to have even more fossil going.
Okay, I think that Frank has another keynote meeting presentation in a couple of minutes. So we'll just quickly go through these last two questions. So the one from Richard Andrews for Adele. You mentioned the risk of whiplash as successive administrations swung 180 degrees on climate action. Given the limitations you highlighted, what is likely to be possible through legislation, what are the other measures or approaches that the Biden administration can take to make any changes that they institute durable in the event of another Republican win in the future?
Yeah, this durability of policy is so important in a challenge like climate, right? Like, isn't it pretty much the least cost-effective thing you can do is to go from one policy extreme to the other every 4 to 8 years, when your real problem is extremely long life capital and steering that towards decarbonization. So I mean, in my opinion, much harder to change law than regulation. Not everybody agrees with that, but I've been watching this a long time, and I think we need bipartisan legislation to really get at the durability. Now, yes, you cannot bind future Congresses, but if you have some bipartisanship in this process, then I think there's potential. And then of course you got to, design the policy well and make sure, like Frank was saying, that you don't have, dislocated subpopulations that then, really work against the perpetuation of the policy. There's a lot of things that have to go right, but the durability is key just to get that investment that you need to really solve the problem. And that's, what are going to be the drivers of really changing the energy sector and the other emitting sectors? And that durability question is so important.
And the last question from Jonathan Pickering. Thanks very much for the excellent presentations. My question was about whether there are any other levers an incoming Biden administration might have to encourage countries such as Australia to adopt more ambitious climate policies, apart from general diplomatic engagement, dialogue, reputational pressure, and trade measures. For example, what about the possibilities for expanding bilateral cooperation between the US and Australia on research and development relating to clean technologies?
Well, I'll give you my 2 cents. I mean, I'm all for bilateral cooperation, and R&D is certainly a good way to do it. But really, you need economic cooperation. You need those finance ministers to get in there and say, okay, well, you're going to have a carbon tax of X. Well, we're going to match you. And what's yours going to be? And what is it going to cover? And hey, let's have a bilateral carbon tax treaty. I mean, we have every other kind of tax treaty. And maybe you can, in my dream world, of course, you'd have all these most powerful ministries talking with each other about how to actually adopt the policies and retain the policies that are going to really work. And that's not to say R&D isn't important, but it's just like a small slice of what we really got to do.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. So thank you very much. Frank's already disappeared. So I'd just like to say thank you especially to Adele for being in from the US, and to Warwick and to Frank, and for Jack and Howard for joining our panel. So please join me in thanking Warwick, Adele, and Frank.
Thank you guys. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much.